Hello, my name's Theodore, but everyone calls me Teddy. What I'm about to narrate is a shocking chapter from my life. I never came from a rich background and worked hard to create a comfortable life for myself. Being wealthy affords you a certain amount of privilege, but it also makes you vulnerable. I recently experienced a deep betrayal exposing just how greedy people could become in the face of money. Although I'm privileged today, things weren't the easiest. Growing up, I didn't come from a home with money or love. Heck, I didn't come from a home at all. Raised in a shoddy countryside orphanage, I'd been abandoned one night and spent my childhood within the tortuous confines of that orphanage. All of us children were raised in horrible conditions, and it was during my childhood that I made up my mind to lead a different life. At 11 years of age, I was taken in by foster parents and expected cruelty and harshness, but their warmth and affection stunned me. I'd never been used to love or parental support, and having such figures in my life after years of fending on my own, well, it was cathartic, to say the least. My foster parents, the Jones, were endlessly supportive and were a stark contrast to life at the orphanage. They provided all the encouragement and optimism that had been sorely missing from my life up until then. I dutifully attended school and eventually college, graduating with an MBA. I'd always had a business bug growing up and aspired to have my own startup. But it was an uphill road toward launching a successful business, and I was oblivious to the toll it would take on those around me. I met my first wife, Sharon, during a college frat party. She was gorgeous, charming, and a gem of a woman. Sharon was also pursuing an MBA then, but confessed that her parents forced her into it. We bonded over our shared interests and started dating during college. Even as we graduated, Sharon was always supportive. What was initially an aimless and frightening time post-graduation felt calming with her by my side. Her presence and support were critical in my early years, which is why her future betrayal would pain me so greatly. A few years after graduation, I started working at a corporate firm while simultaneously building my startup. It was during this time that Sharon and I decided to get married. I was well settled and Sharon didn't wish to pursue anything back then. All she wanted to do was spend time with me, as I wished to with her. We had a beautiful wedding ceremony, and seeing my foster parents present there made my heart brim with joy. But I had no idea just how tumultuous and twisted life would become later on. Sharon and I lived in a spacious home, and I was committed to spending time with her while prioritizing my work as well. I didn't want to risk letting go of a golden corporate career and devote all my time to a risky startup instead. But this is where all the trouble began, and admittedly, it was my fault. Despite assuring Sharon I'd support her, I became more distant and preoccupied with my work. I should have balanced my career and time spent with Sharon, but as I undertook the responsibility of my startup, things became complicated. 5 years after our marriage, Sharon and I welcomed our son, Mason. For a while, it seemed like everything was falling back into place. Mason's arrival breathed new life into Sharon and my relationship. I made a conscious effort to spend more time at home, cutting back on late-night meetings, overtime at the office, and even rolling back on my startup. As busy as I'd been, I needed to put Mason and Sharon first. But trouble emerged shortly. Juggling between home and office became a real task, and I tried as hard as possible to be there for my wife and son. Despite everything that would happen later on, my absence during the initial years was undeniable. I struggled with my intense workload. Sharon took the major brunt of Mason's upbringing, but an explosive argument one night forced me to reassess my priorities. I returned home past midnight to a fuming Sharon in the living room. "I want to talk to you, Teddy." "I'm here, honey." "For once you are. And that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about." "You're never here, Teddy. I love Mason, I love our life, but this is becoming exhausting without you. Mason's barely 5 years old, but you're never around anymore." "I'm sorry, Sharon. It's just that the firm's been a nightmare and the work's overwhelming. My hands are tied too. I know you're busy, but you're just ruining your family at this point. You need to do something, Teddy. We can't continue this way." Sharon's words were piercing yet true. I'd been overworking myself beyond a doubt, but I was unaware of the sheer effect it was taking on her. I'd always been torn between working harder and devoting time to my family by quitting the firm. My fear of the latter was mainly due to the possibility of unemployment. We were well settled, but not enough for me to quit my job so soon. I kept taking occasional breaks, but as Sharon continued to have such conversations with me, I realized I needed to do more. She was dissatisfied and detached from our relationship, and it was time to prioritize my family. Finally, 2 years later, with enough savings in the bank, I decided to take a break from the firm. Sharon's warnings had indeed been an eye-opener to the significance of family, but I had no idea what had happened in those 2 years before I quit the firm. The secret of those 2 years would come up most unexpectedly in the future. Spending time at home with Mason and Sharon was beyond cathartic. Being immersed in work for so long had blinded me to everything I was missing in life. Whether it was taking Mason to daycare or feeding and napping him, I cherished each moment with my son. But it was during this time that Sharon started to grow distant. I couldn't put my finger on the reason, but Sharon would tell me that she was fine and that nothing was wrong. She'd keep leaving the house to meet her friends, but wouldn't return home until hours later. While I enjoyed spending time with Mason, the lack of a connection between Sharon and me was starting to become evident. I knew all marriages endured hardships, but Sharon's distance seemed indicative of a larger issue that she refused to acknowledge. About a year and a half later, I started to become restless at home. I was taking care of Mason and I loved doing so, but Sharon seemed entirely detached from us. There was this unspoken distance between us which only widened as time passed by. To fill the void of her absence, I started working on my startup again. It was foolish of me to do this when I'd promised to be home for Mason, but I ensured all my work was carried out without compromising on our son. One of my retired seniors at the firm, who was investing in my startup, arrived home to discuss the details one evening. I informed Sharon about this in advance, but she appeared unbothered. "Honey, I'm sorry about this whole thing. I just wanted to start some side work on our startup, but it's all work from home. I'm right here, taking care of Mason 24/7. "Okay, honey. Do whatever you want." There was this unmistakable sense of unhappiness in her words, and I was afraid that Sharon was tired of me and our marriage had crossed a point of no return. I scaled back my workload to a minimum. I prioritized Mason as I always had, and tried to be there for Sharon, who unfortunately kept me at arm's length from her life. However, a year later, everything changed for the worse. I'd kept my startup work low-key, but it was gaining momentum. There were other investors on board now and things were looking favorable. Mason and I also spent more time than ever playing baseball, going to the movies, and thoroughly enjoying ourselves. But there was a month crucial for the startup, where Sharon largely took care of Mason, and this month changed our lives. I'd been absent from home, rushing between meetings with investors as Sharon spent time with Mason. He'd been complaining that his joints were hurting, but we didn't think much of it then. We assumed it had to do with all his little league practice. But one afternoon, Sharon asked me to take care of Mason while she ran an urgent errand. She had to meet a friend who was in an emergency. "Just watch Mason for the day, okay? I'll be back soon." Sharon left early and I was home with Mason. He was fast asleep in his room and I was watching TV when I received a sudden phone call. "Hello?" "Hey Teddy, it's George here. I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time." I was instantly nervous. George was the startup's biggest investor and had been arranging a meeting with some major investors for the past week. "We've got 3 of them on board right now. But they want to see a pitch first, Teddy. I need you here." "Well, that's fantastic news, George, but Sharon doesn't get back until 6 p.m. "That won't do, Teddy. The investors are flying out tonight and we'll lose this if we don't act now. This could make or break the company, Teddy, you know this." My heart was racing and my mind was conflicted. Mason was resting inside the room due to his joint pain, and I was afraid to leave him in case he needed me. But as George repeatedly called me and said that there was no room for postponement, I made an incredibly selfish decision. I called upon my neighbor, Bill, to look after Mason while I rushed for a quick meeting. Bill had been our neighbor for the past few years and was quite reliable. It would be an hour back and forth, and I bid Mason goodbye and rushed out. Bill assured me he'd tend to anything Mason might need, but nothing could have prepared me for the events of that day. In hindsight, it was possibly the stupidest thing I've done and I never forgave myself for it. The investor meeting was short, but the pleased look on George and the investors' faces indicated their clear satisfaction. "You weren't wrong, George. You've got a real winner on your hands here." As George and I celebrated our successful pitch, I received a call from Bill. The call that changed my life irreparably. "Hey Bill, what's the matter?" "Teddy, you need to come to the hospital right now." "Hospital ... What are you talking about?" "It's Mason. He fell from his bed and couldn't move. I rushed him to the hospital and you need to be here, Teddy. Now." My heart was pounding as I dashed off to the hospital, barely able to inform George about the emergency. On the way, Bill updated me on Mason's condition. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The doctors suspected a rare condition, and I was terrified to call Sharon since I'd left Mason alone. Despite my fear, I had to inform her. "Sharon, it's Teddy. You need to come to the hospital. It's Mason. What? Is he okay? I'm coming right now." As I reached the hospital and met Bill, my mind was in turmoil. I rushed to Mason's ward and found him pale and in pain. Sharon arrived shortly after, her face sick with worry. Her anxiety worsened mine, and I was racked with shame for leaving our son alone. "Teddy, what's going on? Where's Mason?" The doctors sat us both down and explained the situation. Mason had a potentially rare condition, but they needed to carry out several tests to be sure. Sharon and I spoke to Mason for a bit before he was taken away for the tests. Meanwhile, I thanked Bill for his quick thinking. Sharon and I spent the next 48 hours in the hospital, waiting anxiously for Mason's results. During those hours, my guilt and fear gnawed at me. Once Sharon learned that I'd left Mason alone, she refused to speak to me. Her silence spoke volumes, and I knew that our lives were about to change drastically. The same doctor summoned us to his cabin after a long wait. There's no easy way to break this. Turns out my initial diagnosis was right. We carried out some key tests, but it's revealed what we feared: Mason has joint idiopathic arthritis. The doctor explained that this condition, though rare, caused persistent joint inflammation and pain. It would require ongoing treatment and would significantly impact Mason's daily life. Sharon's face crumpled with grief, and I could see the devastation in her eyes. She would never look at me the same way again. I felt helplessness for having prioritized work over my son's well-being. How could I have been so selfish? In the days that followed, Mason was discharged from the hospital and under the care of a physical therapist at home. Despite the events of the week, I hoped Sharon and I would be brought closer again while we cared for our son together. Unfortunately, nothing could have been further from the truth. As Mason's therapist left for the day, Sharon told me that there was something on her mind. "This has been a long time coming, Teddy. I'm sorry it had to be now, but I'm sick of you. I can't do this anymore. What you did was unforgivable." "Sharon, what are you saying?" "I'm telling you that we're through, Teddy. This marriage is finished, and I'm going to court to take custody of my son." The words sent a jolt through my spine. Any hope for reconciliation was shattered, and the suddenness of her words crushed me. I tried desperately to talk Sharon out of it, but she'd already made up her mind. What came next was a whirlwind. For the next year, an ugly legal battle ensued. Sharon's parents and the therapist cared for Mason, while Sharon and I dealt with the fallout from the divorce. Her lawyer very adeptly put forth arguments for my absence and neglect over the years, and how I'd prioritized work even on the day of Mason's fall. The judge reached a verdict granting us both joint custody, but declaring Sharon as Mason's primary caregiver. The verdict felt like a sharp blow. Despite all my efforts, I was ultimately left with a distant role in my son's life. The fact that I could no longer stay with him broke my heart. Mason was bedridden with treatments, and Sharon would occupy our earlier home. With a heavy heart, I purchased a smaller apartment just a few miles away from our old one and stayed alone. Losing Mason from my life felt as though I'd be stripped of any significant purpose. The startup felt meaningless, and I was racked with guilt and shame for an entire year. I was living off my savings but continued to pay Sharon a huge alimony sum along with money for Mason's treatment. I began to see Mason less frequently, and all my visits were made awkward by having to remain at Sharon's house as she counted the hours until I left. I was overwhelmed and exhausted by the tragic turn my life had taken. I spent the entirety of the next year spiraling into a cycle of self-blame and hatred. Struggling with my rising financial troubles, I began work on my startup again. The bills were stacking up, and I had to do something about it. I contacted George, and the two of us had a long discussion as he promised to speak to the investors again. Within a few months, our startup picked up steam once more. Once we were up and running after a tedious hiring process, George and I set up an office near my house, and we were finally in action. It was surreal to have launched my dream startup, and it's what helped lift my spirits during such a bleak time. Even though I promptly sent the money to Sharon, she started coming up with excuses to cancel my visits with Mason. She'd either fake sickness or state that she had guests over, and I became frustrated by Sharon's control over my visits. She'd leave me ugly, insulting voicemails and how she never felt happy with me. But everything changed after I met Aubrey. The startup was performing excellently, and the turnover was remarkable. I started buying more gifts for Mason and tried to visit him often, but Sharon's shadow loomed large over us. I tried distracting myself with work, and as I went downtown to meet a new client at a hotel, I met Aubrey. She was a lawyer who was waiting for a client too, and the two of us got talking about our professions. We met with our respective clients and grabbed a drink afterward. It felt strange having such conversations and a connection with another woman after Sharon, and I wrestled with the guilt for a long time. But Aubrey seemed like completely a different person, and as I revealed the hardships of my marriage with Sharon, about Mason and the errors I'd made, Aubrey understood them entirely. The two of us continued to meet and became closer over time. As my startup flourished, I shifted Sharon and Mason into a larger home and ensured the best facilities for Mason. Weighed down by guilt, I often approached Sharon about our relationship, hoping to make amends again. I asked her during a visit to see Mason, but it was clear that she'd given up hope. "Stop bothering me, Teddy. This isn't going to work. Heck, I don't care if you meet someone else too, just don't miss paying me." Sharon's harsh words only cemented the fact that our marriage could never be salvaged. I spent more time with Aubrey and realized I'd clearly caught feelings for her. She was extremely passionate about her career, intelligent and understanding. And as the months flew by, Aubrey and I eventually confessed our feelings to each other. Even though there was a mutual attraction, the guilty conscience of Mason and Sharon weighed heavy on my mind. But during one of my visits to Sharon, my guilt disappeared instantly. As I arrived at our old home and hugged Mason, Sharon was preparing to leave the house for dinner. "Where are you going?" "Just going out for a date with someone. What business is it of yours?" I needed someone to get over how pathetic of a husband you were. With that cold remark, Sharon stormed out. The news caught me completely off guard, and in a strange sense, this revelation liberated me of my guilt. I'd been carrying the emotional baggage of the past, never realizing that Sharon had so easily moved on. It dawned on me then that perhaps we both needed to move on, without compromising on our parental duties towards Mason. But the events of the future would rattle me to my core. I could have never predicted what lay ahead. After spending about 2 years together, Aubrey and I got married in a small, intimate ceremony. She moved into my new apartment, and we started creating a life of our own. Something that filled my heart with joy was the fact that Aubrey and Mason got along extremely well. As his condition seemed to improve, Aubrey, Mason, and I spent loads of time together. It felt like a blissful bubble. However, Sharon's resentment was quite evident when I dropped Mason home one night. "You're having too much fun, aren't you? You, Mason, and your cheap plastic wife. Nice little family, huh?" "What are you talking about, Sharon? You know what I mean? You're both degenerates and better not steal my son from me. Keep sending that money." She slammed the door shut, and I thought over everything I'd just heard. There was a sudden fear in my mind that Sharon may try to renegotiate the terms of Mason's custody. It seemed pretty plausible as she became more bitter each time Aubrey and I picked up Mason during our visits. One winter, I decided to take Aubrey and Mason to visit my foster parents. They were delighted by the company, and I let Sharon know in advance. However, on the day of our visit, Sharon called us an hour before we were to pick up Mason. "Listen, I don't think Mason's up for a visit today." "What do you mean?" "Aubrey and I are all set to pick him up. My parents are ready too." "Something's happened to him, Teddy. His condition's worsened." Shaken by this sudden news and fearful of Mason's condition, I canceled the plans and rushed with Aubrey to check up on Mason. Sharon asked us to meet her at the hospital. The three of us spoke to a doctor who explained that Mason had developed severe complications and required advanced treatment. He could remain home with Sharon, but the therapy, increased tests, and treatment would all cost a whopping $10,000 a month. I was stunned by the amount. It was undoubtedly excessive, but I'd vowed never to compromise for Mason, and I wouldn't. The doctor said he'd be in touch with Sharon and that she'd relay any major updates to us if required. A few days after meeting with the doctor, Sharon told me to meet her at the old house. She'd spoken to the doctor and he'd told her how to execute the financial arrangements. Without wasting time, I visited Sharon but was surprised to see another man in the living room. He was smartly dressed in a sharp suit, but was far from a doctor figure. "Who's this?" "Teddy, this is Hunter. He's the financial advisor recommended by the hospital. He's here to smoothen out the whole process." "Nice to meet you. I'll be handling the financial deposits for Mason's treatment." There was this strange look of familiarity exchanged between Hunter and Sharon, but I paid no attention to it at the time. Hunter gave me a couple of forms to fill out and told me that the checks for Mason had to be deposited to an institution called MetaLife. He explained that MetaLife would be administering the treatment and medication for Mason and was a top-of-the-line medical organization recognized by the hospital doctor himself. I acted blindly and complied with all demands. After all, I wanted the best possible treatment for my son. Hunter shared the contact number of MetaLife with me in case I faced any concerns. Without further ado, I signed a check for $10,000 towards MetaLife and handed it over to Hunter. He was beaming and walked out. It was an exorbitant sum, but when I entered Mason's bedroom, it honestly felt as though no amount of money was too much for my son's health. Months passed by and I continued depositing $10,000 checks towards MetaLife, and Sharon would call to let me know that Mason was improving. It was heartwarming to hear about his progress. However, when it came to my visits, Sharon started to scale down on them, inventing a new excuse each time. Ranging from physical therapy to minor surgery, my visits with Mason soon became non-existent. Sharon also started demanding more alimony money, and when I refused, she'd curse me and blame me for being a neglectful father to Mason. To make matters worse, my startup suffered a major blow during this time. There was a problem with our usual distribution channel, and the delayed orders cost us a fortune. George, the executive officers, and I scrambled for damage control, and while we got the situation under control, our heavy losses were irreversible. Mason's expensive treatment, in addition to Sharon's alimony, coupled with expenses at home with Aubrey, started to become a significant financial strain. However, Aubrey's unflinching support will forever be etched in my mind. I confessed the situation to her one evening, but her response reflected utmost solidarity. We're in this together. No matter what happens, we'll cut back on our expenses, whatever it takes for Sharon's alimony and Mason's treatment. Anything for him. I'm right here with you, Teddy. Aubrey's words of support and acts of sacrifice were unbelievable. I couldn't imagine someone being this supportive, but she promised to stick by my side. I kept depositing the expensive checks, but Sharon continued limiting my visits with Mason. She'd hurl abuses at me over the phone and say the most horrible things about Aubrey and me. It's like I didn't recognize her anymore. She'd hound me if her alimony was even a day late, and she threatened to take me to court as well and seize full custody of Mason. Aubrey and I carried on with financial sacrifices for Mason until the startup bounced back to its earlier state after a tedious year. It made me feel guilty to see Aubrey making such sacrifices, even canceling meetings with her clients to emotionally support me at home. I couldn't have asked for a better partner, but I would have certainly asked for a different future because I wasn't remotely prepared for the one that was to come. As the abrupt visits with Mason and the hefty MetaLife checks continued, I received a call from Sharon when I was driving back home one evening. "What is it now, Sharon?" "Dad?" "It's me. Mason." I was caught by surprise. Just hearing his voice made me feel better. "Mason, how are you, son? Your mom's keeping me from seeing you, it's been ages. What's the matter?" "Dad, how could you do this to me?" "What are you talking about?" "Dad, I don't have a single treatment for my penny right now." I froze. My entire world seemed to collapse as I replayed Mason's words in my head. Not a single penny. "Mason, what do you mean? I've been depositing checks every month." "It's okay. You can stop lying, Dad." "Mason, I'm not lying. I've been depositing $10,000 to you each month for your treatment." "Then why don't I have a single penny, Dad?" Before I could respond, there was some muffling over the phone and I heard Sharon's voice. "Hey, Teddy. We're at the hospital right now. Mason's under some pretty heavy medication, so he's talking gibberish. Sharon, he just told me he hasn't received a single penny for his treatment. Like I said, he's on heavy medication. Listen, we're kind of busy right now. I'll call you later." "Wait, do I come to the hospital?" No, it's a different one." "Look, Teddy, I don't have time for this. I'll fill you in later." Sharon abruptly cut the call as I wondered what was going on. Determined to uncover the truth, I contacted the MetaLife number Hunter had given me, but there was no response. I rushed to the hospital where Mason had been originally treated, and I tracked down his doctor. I inquired about MetaLife and where Mason was, however the doctor was shocked. "I didn't recommend anything of the sort to your wife. I've never heard of MetaLife before. I kept calling your wife for updates on Mason, but she never returned my calls." I felt my blood run cold. Something was seriously wrong. I kept trying the meet-a-life number followed by Sharon's cell, but to no avail. Forced with no other option, I rushed to my old house for answers. To my surprise, there was a maid who opened the door for me. Since when could Sharon afford a maid? "Can I help you?" "Hello, my name's Teddy. I'm Mason's father. Is Sharon here?" "Oh, Madam isn't home right now. Would you like to wait inside?" "Sure." I waited in the living room as both the maid and I tried contacting Sharon but received no response. Worried about Mason's health, I started pacing around the living room anxiously, and that's when I saw it. There was a stack of papers lying on a coffee table. It had been neatly kept in a folder. I didn't pay any heed to them initially, but a closer look revealed that they were bank statements. I picked the most recent statement and examined it. It revealed extravagant purchases, some totaling $30,000, $40,000 and more. As my eyes read the name on the statement, my head started to spin. This couldn't be. All these purchases were made by Midlife. But the bigger question was why this bank statement was simply lying around Sharon's house. Now overwhelmed with worry and desperate for answers, I contacted the Midlife number again. There was an answer this time, but the voice on the other end left me speechless. "Hello, this is Hunter." "What?" "Hunter." I heard some mumbling on the other end, and Hunter abruptly cut the call. My head nearly exploded from the ambiguity of what was going on. What was Midlife's bank statement doing around Sharon's house? Why did the Midlife number lead to Hunter? What was happening? Turns out I didn't have to wait any longer for answers as I heard the doorbell ring and the maid opened the door for Sharon. She froze once. She saw me. I'd caught her by surprise. I held up the Midlife bank statement and Sharon's face fell instantly. "Do you mind explaining this? What on earth is a medical company statement doing in your house? Since when does a medical company spend $20,000 on luxury clothing and club memberships?" Sharon sat down wordlessly, and it was evident she couldn't get out of this one. She'd been caught left red-handed. She burst into tears and broke down. "I'm so sorry, Teddy. I can explain, please." Sharon tearfully mumbled about the growing expenses she was facing and how the alimony amount was insufficient for her new lifestyle. When she realized how much money was coming in for Mason's treatment, she became desperate and invented a fictional company called Midlife with Hunter. "Wait, how do you know Hunter? Why would an ordinary banker help you embezzle money?" Sharon cried some more, and when I pressured her, she finally confessed a truth that broke me. Hunter had been her affair partner for years, right from college days when he was her ex-boyfriend, a fact she'd hidden from me. When we were married, she became tired of my workaholic attitude and started an affair with Hunter, and the frequent times she stepped out of the house were when she sneaked out to meet Hunter. My heart shattered into a million pieces. Despite everything that had transpired between Sharon and me, I continued to respect her. But the news of her affair during our marriage, coupled with the horrible scheme she pulled off at the expense of our son. There was no coming back from this. I learned that Mason's treatment had begun just 2 days ago at some third-rate hospital. I contacted Aubrey and told her about the entire scheme. As she rushed to the hospital where Mason was, I got in touch with my lawyer and the authorities. The fact that someone could be this selfish for money so as to endanger their own son. I had no words. Over the next few months, fierce legal proceedings followed and I fought as hard as I could for justice. Hunter had absconded the city but was eventually tracked down and arrested. He'd been involved in other frauds too. His banking career was ruined. Sharon was arrested as well for her part in the Midlife scheme, and the two of them were put behind bars. Additionally, in light of Sharon's affair during our marriage, the judge revised the custody verdict and transferred Mason's custody entirely over to Aubrey and me. We started the best care for Mason, as was initially intended, and I couldn't be happier that he was finally within our care. I did feel guilty for depriving him of Sharon, but I hoped under Aubrey and my care, Mason could flourish and we could begin anew as a family. After the shocking betrayal we'd been through, there was finally a sense of peace. Justice had been delivered.